Hello, this is the Mae B Mindful Podcast, and I am your host, Hannah Mae. I'm a mother of 6, conscious birth instructor and educator, spiritual growth facilitator, and certified hypnotist. This podcast is about inspiring hope, expanding awareness and consciousness in order to revolutionize the way we live and experience our lives. You can expect thought-provoking episodes each week spanning a range of topics, drawing from both my own journey of transformation and healing and working with others. I hope you find this podcast to be informative, refreshing, illuminating, and instrumental in your own soul's evolution and growth. Let's jump right in. Hey guys, welcome back to the Mae B Mindful Podcast. I'm your host, Hannah Mae, and I'm so flippin' excited to talk to you about this topic today that seems pretty elusive and a lot of people have a lot of confusion about. People don't know what it is unless they're in active recovery from this condition, and it's codependency. I have had a journey with this. It's been a really powerful journey that has gotten down to a lot of my core stuff. I think when people can wrap their minds around what it is and identify in, because in my experience, more people struggle with this than they realize. It can go under the radar and be very innocuous seeming, manifesting actually pretty harmfully and pretty degrading to your emotional, spiritual, and physical condition over time. Yet it is really easy to be very unaware of how this stuff is operating. So my introduction to this was about, 13 years ago. And the person that was actually mentoring me at the time and sponsoring me in a different fellowship kept throwing out there, she's like, hey, so why don't we try a coda meeting? And I was like, why does she keep saying that? Does she know something I don't know? Turns out she did. That first meeting I went to, I remember like listening to the list, like the laundry list of qualifications. And I just literally was like jaw dropped, and I identified for the first time, and I couldn't stop laughing. Actually, I was like, oh my gosh, it just was resonating and like pinging on such a deep level. And I just kept looking at her like jaw dropped, like what in the fuck is going on here? How have I been operating with this problem, not knowing what it was? And it's really powerful to identify. I'm not into like labeling necessarily and pigeonholing yourself or limiting yourself with these labels, because they can be restrictive sometimes. But when you really truly can identify in with something, it is powerful, especially when you see how it's been operating in your life and how it's really been running this show under the surface. This really started me on a whole journey. My deeper work didn't start until much later than that. It set me up to just become slightly more aware. And it has been a really powerful evolutionary process in getting back to my authentic self, reconnecting with myself, getting to know myself, learning how to listen to myself, and making honest choices rather than compulsive ones. It is a largely impulse-driven state, although if one is operating in that, they generally don't realize it in my experience and what I've witnessed in others, because it's just part of your hardwiring. We're not born with it. However, it's part of our conditioning. So it comes from somewhere, and it is really stemming from wounding, from unmet needs, from the father wound, from the mother wound at its core, I believe, as I've experienced it and as I witness. But I'm going to try and unpack this and keep this relatively short. Let's see how short I can keep it and not go off on too many tangents, because this is a multi-episode topic, because it has so many various manifestations, and oftentimes it's very intertwined with and can overlap with other compulsions and other addictions, and it actually can get pretty complex, and it is a lot to navigate for ourselves. But as with anything, when we really get open and become willing to seek, we can get down to the truth of things, and it can be really pretty simplified at its core. Getting there sometimes is like kind of going through a maze, but I'm going to do my best to keep it simple and hopefully explain it in a way where you can either go, check, yes, I do that, or no, that's not me. And whatever it is okay. You know, the only thing that really matters is like honesty and truthfulness at the end of the day. So I believe, and the way I define it, at least in this moment, and I'm probably going to go back and like want to redefine it another way as soon as I listen to this and be like, shit, I didn't say this. Is codependency is a core basic need to know your value and worth. But in having lost it, having disconnected from it at some earlier time and through prior conditioning, you don't know it. But in not knowing it and not being able to access it, and as a result, the pain that is experienced in that disconnect with true self, you end up seeking your validation and well-being in others, seeking to get these core needs met from others, which are dictated by our natural social instincts, security instincts. So there's nothing wrong with them. But the unmet need for the child is a setup, and the wounding that is created out of that, the pain that comes from that, is a setup then to take those needs to be met to the world forevermore until you find a way to meet those needs. And the person that is best equipped to meet those needs is none other than you. You are the person that is perfectly tailored and designed to meet those needs for yourself so that you no longer have to take them to the world and to others outside of you. When you take your needs for validation, approval, love, wholeness to those outside of you, which most likely, if it's an unmet need, you're going to be taking them to that template of individual that created that wound in the first place by not meeting them. Therefore, setting yourself up to have them continuously not met. This compounds the issue and ends up resulting in a loss of self further, a greater disconnect, a further divide within. And this becomes more and more painful because if you're living in this way, you're not living authentically, you're not living in alignment with your true self. And we are just not designed to thrive and function in that way or in that mode for very long. That is an incredibly painful way to live. And then that further drives these impulses and need to fix this problem for ourselves, albeit oftentimes the person who's suffering from that is pretty unaware that they're doing it. Once they start to become aware, then it's oftentimes a situation where you're like, wow, I'm really overextending myself here, or like, this didn't feel very good, yet you might still find yourself doing it anyways, because at this point, these grooves are pretty deep, and these patterns can be very difficult to shift and change when part of the problem in the first place is that you don't feel that you have permission to change them. There is this sort of like rule book that's just this automatic, like if you actually were to look at those rules and go, where did these rules actually originate from? Who wrote this rule book? And hey, if you really take a look at it, like how come those people over there don't follow the rule book? They do really well not following the rule book. They seem to get all their needs met just fine. In fact, maybe they're on the other side of the spectrum from you. If you are living in this way, you're overextending yourself because guess what? People who are, I'm just going to call them takers, okay? And there's a whole spectrum here of takers. There are people that, and not to judge them, although it's hard not to sometimes if they're particularly careless, if the way they operate is by just doing what they think they need to do to get their needs met without considering you, because they're operating out of their pain and their unmet needs, then you are in fact the perfect person to meet those needs. Because if you give tirelessly, endlessly, impulsively, without thought, without regard for yourself, and you don't say no, well, You're a great person to know for somebody that can't hear no. Not to mention, for somebody that doesn't like boundaries set for them, that's another great reason why they're going to like you, because you're not going to have a boundary with them, most likely. That would be a very healthy thing to do. So once you start getting healthy and well, and you understand and know that that's actually how you recover, that's actually how you self-care, is by having these boundaries for yourself, then these people are going to continue to steamroll over you. So most likely you're going to attract those people, and those people are going to attract you. It's an unfortunate setup. I believe it's designed that way to hopefully bring things to our awareness, to create balance, so that we can then recognize our problem when it becomes too painful and become willing to make changes, because nobody else is going to make these changes for us. These are the things we have to step into our power and agency with, and that takes courage. So some trademarks, characteristics, traits, qualities, or examples of codependent behavior are, and I'm going to just give you a few: taking responsibility for things and taking ownership of things that actually aren't your problem, that are not your job to handle or address, yet you find yourself even maybe volunteering just organically to take them on at the expense of yourself, at the expense of your own energy, even problem solving or fixing things, or taking ownership of things, tasks, duties, even that are not yours to take on, that maybe you've not even been asked to take on, yet you've impulsively found yourself offering to do them and taking that role on for somebody as fixer in some way. Accepting blame for things and being accountable, overly accountable for things that, or overly apologetic for things that actually are not yours to take ownership for. Sort of like the endless martyrdom of being accountable for something that actually is not truthful, and that ends up resulting in an imbalance in a relationship. And this is a really big one: not giving yourself permission to take care of your own needs, not giving yourself permission to put yourself first, the belief that that is selfish, the belief that anything you do for yourself is selfish. And there's this inner dialogue usually that goes along with that, that there's usually this inner dialogue that coincides with this, that is just an absolute dictator in regards to this. It is a stringent master of like, no, you self-sacrifice. No, you give up the front seat. No, you don't get your needs met. No, you don't take time for yourself, even if that's what you're emotionally deeply in need of. You disregard, you spend yourself, you spread yourself thin, and only you pay the price. Only you pay the price. And then most likely what happens is you end up really resentful. You end up feeling victimized and resentful. This is an incredibly painful way to live, because you are compounding any abandonment issues or unmet needs that you already have, because there is a complete abandonment of self in this, and a further disconnect. And I've talked about this a lot, but we are designed to thrive in connection, and connection is the antidote to all disease. And so when we abandon ourselves, the one person that we are wholly responsible for meeting the needs of, to listening to the most, to all the subtle nuances. Nobody else knows what those are but you. Nobody knows you or has the opportunity to know these things about you, even with the person that knows you most, that maybe thinks they know you better than you do, that maybe notices things about you that you don't even notice about yourself. Nobody can do that at any given time. You are, like I said, the perfect package. You're the person for that job. So when you fail yourself in that and you abandon yourself in that, then you lose access to your authenticity. And essentially, you knock yourself out of alignment. It's almost like you're walking around like outside of yourself all the time. And it's actually a way to, I've found, disassociate a lot of the time, because it's a huge distraction from self. And it's a distraction from having to be present with your needs and your pain, ultimately your pain and your wounding at the core. So until we really start to wake up to this stuff, to have an open mind to like, hey, maybe there's another way to do it. Just maybe this rule book, this dictator in my head is not the voice that I should be listening to. Where did that voice come from? Was I born with that voice? Is that really how I perceive higher power, God? Is that like, I don't know, does God want me to just not consider myself? I'm very much in alignment with death of self, death of the ego, death of the lower self, though. The higher self actually calls for a very high level of self-care, right? Like even Jesus was like, he would like pull off the crowd. He would have to step away from his healing work and the miracles and ministering to people and others. He would have to take breaks in order to go refuel and fill up. He was constantly setting that example of taking time to be alone in prayer to get refueled. What is that if that's not self-care? And until we break this cycle, then we stay disconnected. We continue to set ourselves up in this rigged game of disappointment because it doesn't ever meet the deeper need in us to lose ourselves to other people. And that is the real pain in it, is that usually we lose a connection with who we are, with what we love. And sometimes, and this is not uncommon, but sometimes people get so lost to who they are, they become so disconnected that they don't even know what they enjoy anymore. They don't know what they like. They don't really even know what they think. They sort of just align with what somebody else thinks in order to feel a part of, to live through that person. And a lot of times it's in relationship, but it can also manifest in just like this idea of groupthink and mentality. This is a real bummer when that happens, because we really owe it to ourselves to rekindle that joy of the child within. And most children, even if they have traumatic lives, when they're operating from a place of play and imagination, they're very connected with themselves and they're joyful. I know for me as a kid, there were certain things that I did that I loved, that gave me so much joy, that I would get so lost in, that it didn't matter what was going on in the outside world. It didn't matter what pain I experienced or maybe what disturbance was happening. In those moments, in my joy, in my authentic flow of whatever was happening in that moment of play and creativity, I was in my bliss. I was like so happy and content. And when I started to shut those things off for myself, and when people start to disconnect with those things and sever that brings them back, those activities and those joys and those things that bring them back to themselves, then that's when someone can lose themselves. And that's when they can need to start to become something for that out there in order to feel different in here, when really that's the opposite direction. We need to say, like, actually for the codependent, the codependent kind of needs to get to a place, in my opinion, where they say, fuck everyone. Like, fuck you, fuck you, fuck you. There are people out there that are going to hear that and be like, that is so selfish and that is very unchristian and blah, blah, blah. But I don't believe that if I'm a child of God here, walking around with all of you, that somehow I'm inferior to all of you. I believe I am your equal. And therefore, I owe myself the same respect, kindness, consideration that I would give you. So if someone has this rule book that they're following in their head of like, I have to do this, this, this. These are the rules that I have to follow in order to be a nice person, or be a selfless person, or be a giving person, in order to like do these things for others, then I have to know that I should be doing them for myself too. And if I'm doing something for others at the cost of myself, then that is incredibly dishonest. And that is a disregard of self. And if I am a child, like if I'm a child of God, what right do I have to disregard myself at the cost of myself for someone else? I don't believe I have that right. I have the ability to. I have the free will to do that, just like somebody can do something incredibly harmful or hurtful to somebody. It doesn't mean it's okay. It doesn't mean it should be condoned. So it's operating from a place of unconsciousness. And as long as we continue to operate from this place of unconsciousness, if we don't question this rhetoric that we're following in our mind, then we'll most likely stay in that pattern. And it's incredibly helpful to get support around this from recovered people who understand it, who really understand it, who have lived it, and who are on the other side of it. Because otherwise, everyone just has an opinion, and opinions are just like assholes. Everybody's got one. You don't need everyone's opinion. This is not something that you need to get feedback from everyone on. This is like, okay, who has some freedom around this? Who can help you nurture yourself back to wholeness? If you've abandoned yourself and you're alone and you're sad and you're trying so desperately to meet these needs for yourself through others, then the goal really needs to be to nurture and nourish yourself back to health. And in order to do that, it is particularly helpful to be able to run something by somebody on a semi-regular or very regular basis when these opportunities and things come up, because they will start to present as you step onto this recovery path. You will have lots of opportunities to start to work this stuff out. And it is incredibly helpful to have people who can say to you, what the fuck are you talking about? Like, I've had people be like, wait a second, hold on a second. Do you know how crazy that sounds? And I'm like, oh, thank you. Because that crazy is the kind of thinking that I need to get away from. So this is not just stuff that we bring to anybody because, when we're healing and we're moving forward in this and trying to get clarity around it and rewire and recondition our thinking around it, and change behaviors in order to protect ourselves, to safeguard ourselves as we heal, because the deeper work really is getting down to that core wounding at the center of it that's driving it. So when we do that, we no longer have to operate from our pain unconsciously and be driven by this stuff. I don't want to operate in my pain. Do you? If you're operating from your pain and you're seeing things only through the filter of your pain with that very narrowed view and with the focus of fixing it, because you got to fix your pain, right? Like, you can't walk around in pain, and we're wired to find a solution for that stuff. So we need to really recondition, rewire, set up some parameters as we go through that work of healing that stuff. And this is really, 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 really hugely critical as you step out onto the path, is creating a container for yourself where you're not going to re-wound and re-injure yourself as you go, because that can actually lead to a lot of setbacks in the process. And so there, most likely, if this is something that's been showing up a lot in your life and you're seeing that it's like deeply interwoven into relationships, there's most likely going to be situations where in order to properly and adequately self-care, you're going to have to really advocate for yourself. You're going to have to set boundaries for yourself. You're going to have to take space from people. There might be relationships that you actually have to sever. And that stuff is so challenging, because if you operate in this way and you think this way, most likely you don't think you have the right to do that. A lot of times people convince themselves that they don't have a right to do that, that they're somehow responsible for that person, and like, who are they to let that person down or cause that person harm? And so the best thing I can say to that is, you are of equal value, right? And if your healing is important in order for you to live a fulfilled, meaningful, purposeful life, and in order to do that, you really do have to know yourself. You have to come back to yourself. Then your role and the responsibility to yourself is so important. And that is your first and foremost responsibility, in my opinion. This takes incredible courage to do this, to step away, to create boundaries. Okay, the boundary is not for the other person. Boundary's not for the other person. The boundary is for you to safeguard your own process of recovery and healing with this stuff. And so if you do, really, really powerful things will happen, because when you start showing up for yourself and you start paying attention to yourself, you start to feel very differently, because you are in fact starting to meet those needs and mend those wounds and those connections that were severed within you. So you're reestablishing connection with yourself. Parts work is really powerful and helpful for this. IFS parts work. Hypnosis is really powerful for this deep connective work, inner child work. This is like getting right down to the core, right down to the core of that wounding. There's really incredible journaling and writing exercise prompts, non-dominant hand writing, this inner child writing, where you can open up a dialogue with yourself, really hear yourself and meet your needs. Because if you open up that dialogue with your inner child, she or he will respond. They may be shut down, but over time, and it won't take long, it just takes a little presence, persistence, and really showing up and being willing to sit with them in that discomfort, they will start to open up and talk to you, and you will rebuild that trust. And this is how you reconnect within yourself and come back online. You get to come back into alignment, like all parts of yourself get to be in harmony. And that's just a beautiful way to be and to live, for hopefully obvious reasons. It sounds like a good thing, right? So just as a few questions to ask yourself to sum up here. If you find yourself, you can ask yourself these questions. If you find yourself taking responsibility for other people's problems and even well-being, and taking on responsibilities that end up draining you, yet finding yourself doing it again and not being able to listen to yourself and say no and have that boundary for yourself, that could be a sign if that is a pattern for you. If you feel like you're able to be indignant and outraged, for example, at something that happens and be angry on someone else's behalf, yet maybe you don't give yourself permission to feel that way and acknowledge that for yourself if the same thing was, say, done to you. If you find yourself accepting intolerable behavior as a result of that, and sweeping the way you feel, just stuffing it down, sweeping it under the rug, and continuing to put yourself in harm's way as a result of not giving yourself permission to be able to do that. If you find, and that's a really big one, that you can't give yourself permission to do something, to take care of yourself, to honestly listen to yourself. Like, as an example, okay, there's a family event. There's a family event. Now, you might not be able to tolerate that. You might, with everything in you, not want to do that. It might not be in your best interest to do that, yet, despite the way you feel, you go anyways. This can get complicated in your mind because you're like, but it's my family, I have to show up, da 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 da. Whatever the reason is, you just genuinely don't feel good or right about going. If you're wired this way and you tend to swing codependent and disregard yourself, these things are really important to listen to, especially if once you've identified some of this stuff and you do move into recovery and attempting to self-care and heal some of this stuff for yourself and reestablish that connection and those boundaries, you really owe it to yourself to safeguard that process so that you don't break and sever that trust that you're working so hard to build. That's all I'm going to say about that for now. And here's another one, and this can also feel a little tricky, but like feeling really high, like in an imbalanced way in giving, like feeling your best when you're giving. Now, this can feel a little gray because I believe that we are most aligned in divine purpose when we are in service a lot of times, but there is some nuance in what that service looks like. So if we're operating from a place of impulsivity with that service, not checking in with ourselves, disregarding ourselves, putting ourselves in harm's way, not listening to our inner guidance system, or just giving recklessly in a way that that's not actually appropriate. I talked recently to another healer, to another practitioner who was giving their time to somebody in a way that was overextending themselves. And it was very impulse driven. It was stemming from a deep need inside after exploring this with them. And they ended up halfway through this conversation where they were like 45 minutes in, they realized, I am overextending myself. I am doing something for this person that I charge my clients for. And it was actually selfish. They realized it was actually about them needing to satisfy some need in themselves, right? And so maybe it was helpful. I don't know. But a lot of times you'll notice that these efforts where you compulsively overgive and overextend yourself can get sucked into a vortex. Maybe you're overgiving of advice. People really rely on you to be present for them, to hold space for them so they can pour their self-pity into this pit that you are. And you hold it and you take it and you nurture them because most likely you're very kind and nurturing, and maybe you have a healing energy, and that's something that people are really attracted to in you. But then you find that they just continue on with their same pattern, and it's actually not serving them. So sometimes we show up in service, if we're doing it from a self-driven, it's actually not the kind of service that is impactful or helpful. And there might be a more effective way to be helpful and to be of service. I have actually found that there are times, and this is a thing, where having a boundary for yourself and speaking honestly and truthfully to someone, even if it disappoints them, is more of service to them than just holding space for something that actually isn't helping them, to create change, just as, in this example. These are all some questions to ask yourself to see where you identify in. So codependency can show up in any and all relationships, and like how we identify with those relationships. So it's really common to show up with your partners, with your spouses, in friendships, with coworkers, like in any area of your life, with children, even as a mother. Like, what a beautiful thing. Like, motherhood is such a beautiful thing. It's such a high calling and vocation. But when we start to overly identify to the point where we lose ourselves, and I see this with moms a lot, where they lose themselves. And I actually think that that's part of the process of motherhood, as a result of the need to, if you really want to do it well, to totally immerse yourself, especially if you have multiple children. And I experienced this too. There was a period where I felt like, I call it like being in the trenches, where I felt like I totally lost myself. I was totally immersed in this, just the job and the responsibility and wanting to do it well, but then losing myself in the process at a certain point and recognizing, like, where is my joy? Where is my joy? And who am I? And it was pretty easy to get back into connection with that, because I knew what I used to love and what used to bring me joy that I had shut off for a period of time. And so I'm so grateful that I started to reconnect with those things and give myself time to do those things. It actually was a necessity. I was like 4 kids deep. I don't know how many years I'd had 4 kids in, but in 7.5 years, I had had 5 children. So I guess I did it in 5 years. So anyways, I can't do the math. This is too complex. But as a result of rekindling that, I was able to wake that stuff up. And, my husband even noticed that in me. And this wasn't anything that like anybody else enforced upon me. And this is the thing with codependency. It's like you might find yourself ending up in relationships where somebody does impose that on you as a result of their selfishness and their needs, to where you choose somebody that aligns with that dialogue that's going in your head and they reinforce it for you. And then those oftentimes can be pretty abusive and harmful situations. But you can also be the only person that's having that expectation of yourself. And so if you don't learn to give yourself permission and identify this stuff and start to see the flaws in that way of thinking and the harm in those ways of thinking and operating as a result of that, then you're not going to change anyway. So in my situation, my husband was super supportive, and whatever you want to do for yourself, I had to get to my own place of pain with that and recognize, like, wow, this was something that I was really, really needing to rekindle for myself. And interestingly, when I did that, when I reconnected with dance, actually, and hooping, I need to do an episode on hoop dance one day and flow arts. That would be really fun. That's when things started to really open up and unlock for me, like re-accessing that movement and that love for movement and creative expression in my body began to unlock some things that I had really shut down. And it really was a doorway and a path, I believe, into much deeper, expansive healing, which is really cool because it's all connected. So we really need to listen to our passions and listen to what sparks interest in us and be willing to make that a priority in our lives to do that. As I was saying, codependency can show up in any and all relationships, but we are in the future going to talk specifically about codependency in romantic relationships because there are definitely added dynamics and complexities with that. So I look forward to that chat. Until next time, I hope this was somewhat helpful and created a little more clarity. As always, if you have any questions, DM me. Love you guys. Bye.
Thank you for tuning in to the Mae B Mindful Podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review. Your feedback helps us grow and improve. For more information, resources, and exclusive content, visit our website at maybemindful.com or go ahead and follow us over on Instagram at Mae B Mindful. If you enjoyed this week's episode, please give me a follow, screenshot the episode, and go ahead and tag me until next week when I bring you another thought-provoking and inspiring topic. Until then,